It is my honor to welcome all of you here to this special gathering as we open our hearts and minds during the 2025 Jubilee year. The Jubilee, as you may know, is a sacred time of celebration, renewal, and grace. We are called to immerse ourselves more deeply in our faith through the sacraments, pilgrimages, acts of mercy, and intellectual programming. Pope Francis, in his inauguration of this holy year, has invited us to become pilgrims of hope. He reminds us that we must fan the flame of hope that has been given us and help everyone to gain new strength and certainty by looking to the future with an open spirit, a trusting heart, and far-sighted vision. These words challenge and inspire us to restore a climate of hope and trust in our world, a much-needed prelude to the renewal and rebirth that we so urgently desire. The Jubilee officially began in Rome on December 24th, when Pope Francis opened the holy doors at the Vatican. Bishop Okowiak processed with hundreds of parishioners into the cathedral on Sunday, January 29th, to begin our Grand Rapids Pilgrimage of Hope. Today, we begin a series of intellectual programs here at Aquinas that will be offered monthly throughout this holy year, ending in December. We are deeply blessed to have with us today Sister Barbara Reid. Sister Barbara is a Dominican sister of Grand Rapids who holds a Ph.D. in Biblical Studies from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. She earned both a Bachelor's of Arts and a Master of Arts here at Aquinas College. Currently, Sister Barbara serves as a member of our Board of Trustees, and she is the president and Carroll Stuhlmueller CP, Distinguished Professor of New Testament Studies at Catholic Theological Union. She has taught at CTU since 1988 and has led many study tours and retreats into the Holy Lands. She is author of more than a dozen books and numerous articles, most recently at the Table of Holy Wisdom, Global Hungers and Feminist Biblical Interpretations, which is a 2023 Paulist publication, as well as 2-volume commentary on the Gospel of Luke that she co-authored with Professor Shelly Matthews in the Wisdom Commentary series from Liturgical Press, for which she is also general editor. In addition, as if that wasn't already enough, she is one of the general editors for the new Jerome Biblical Commentary for the 21st century, published by Bloomsbury Press, 2022. This evening, Sister Barbara will lead us in exploring the biblical notion of Jubilee as a time of restoration, freedom, and grace-filled renewal. She will invite us to reflect on examples of our ancestors in faith who set out as pilgrims of hope with an open spirit, a trusting heart, and a willingness to embrace the unknown with utter confidence in God, who is ever faithful. Their witness can guide us forward to be pilgrims of hope in our day. So before I begin, and before Sister Barbara comes up, I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to the Jubilee Year Planning Committee for their dedication and vision in organizing this event and all future presentations. There will be one every month of the Jubilee year here at Aquinas. Your efforts are truly appreciated and make gatherings like this possible. So let us now prepare to enter this time of reflection and renewal with open hearts. Please join me in warmly welcoming Sister Barbara Reid.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cordova, for that very generous and kind introduction. I'm so pleased to be here with you this evening. In early November, it was a Monday morning, and I opened up my email early in the morning, and there was a message from Kendall Pavano, Dr. Cordova's assistant, and she says, "Do you have time today to meet with President Cordova to discuss Jubilee programming?" And my first thought was, oh, how lovely. President Cordova somehow got wind that I'm celebrating my 50th, my Golden Jubilee this year. as a Dominican sister of Grand Rapids, along with my classmate, Elizabeth Allen. And she wants to make sure that the dates that she's setting for board meetings won't conflict with our congregational Jubilee celebrations. So you see where my mind was going when I hear Jubilee. So I quickly got on board, though, and I realized that what we were going to talk about was the Jubilee year that Pope Francis declared for this year, 2025, that as President Cordova said, began on Christmas Eve when Pope Francis opened the Holy Door to St. Peter's Basilica. And then 10 children from 10 different countries, holding hands with their parents, crossed the threshold after the Pope and the altar servers, and then 54 more people from 27 nations passed through. And among the first to cross through the threshold were also representatives from other churches, other Christian churches. And the Dicastery for Promoting Christian Unity explained that entering through the Holy Door expresses the willingness to follow and to be guided by the only begotten Son of God. So we can't, probably most of us aren't going to go to Rome. We're not going to go through the Holy Door. So what is this Jubilee year about, and what does it ask of us? Christians, as you may know, have had the custom of observing Jubilee years as a time of renewal ever since 1300, when Pope Boniface VIII instituted the first Holy Year. Initially, it was celebrated, the Jubilee year was celebrated every 100 years. Then, following the biblical precedent, which I'll talk about in just a minute, every 50 years, and then finally every 25 years. And so as I look around the room, most of you will remember 25 years ago, the Jubilee year proclaimed by Pope St. John II ushered in the beginning of the second Christian millennium. But Pope Francis didn't wait 25 years to proclaim another Jubilee year, and you'll remember that 10 years ago, in 2015, he declared an extraordinary Jubilee year to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the closing of the Second Vatican Council, in which, and the focus of that Jubilee year, as you remember, was mercy. I wanted him to make it forever, not just that one Jubilee year. But I think he is, and I'll say more about that in a minute. This year, as you know, the theme is Pilgrims of Hope, which is a very fitting continuation from the Year of Mercy, since the source of our hope, as Pope Francis reminds us, is God's mercy and grace. In a Jubilee year, typically there's an emphasis on forgiveness, on the granting of indulgences, and especially for pilgrimages to holy places. But before we talk about how we observe a Jubilee year, I'd like to speak a bit about the origins of Jubilee in the scriptures. And understanding the intent of Jubilee in biblical times can help indicate for us both the kinds of practices that it suggests and the disposition of heart into which it invites us. So the laws about the Jubilee year can be found in the book of Leviticus, chapter 25. It prescribes that the Jubilee year is to occur every 50th year, and three things are to happen. The first is all Israelite slaves are to be freed. Second, the land was to lie fallow. Third, all ancestral lands that had been sold during the 50 years were to be redeemed by their original owners. We'll get to, so what does that look like in 2025? So the Jubilee year was to begin on the Day of Atonement, the day which the community sought release for their sins. And the Jubilee attempts to redress especially some of Israel's sins against its own members, so within the Israelite community. The Jubilee opened with the blowing of a ram's horn called the Yobel, and that's the Hebrew word from which the word Jubilee derives. At the beginning of the Jubilee, the community was commanded, quote, "Let the trumpet resound. The trumpet blast shall re-echo throughout the land. This 50th year you shall make sacred by proclaiming liberty in the land for all its inhabitants." So a proclamation of liberty. That's Leviticus 25, 9 to 10. Now, to understand the stipulations of the Jubilee law, it's first important that we grasp what were the economic realities of the people of Israel. Most people lived with very little economic security. Even when a family owned land, they were always in danger of falling into an escalating cycle of debt. All it took was a drought, a war, a pestilence that could destroy their crops and devastate their harvest and cause the family to have to then borrow in order to plant crops the following year. And if that happens again, you can see where this cycle is going. So imagine what could happen to a person, to a family, as they got deeper and deeper and deeper into debt. And when debts could not be met, what can you do? So families could do three things. They could, number one, sell their land. Number two, they could become day laborers. Or number three, in worst case scenario, they could indenture themselves as slaves until their debts were met. So imagine such a situation. What are you going to do as you're getting more and more desperate and falling into debt? So if you choose the first option and sold your land, what does that mean for your future? Your means of livelihood and your self-sufficiency is gone. The sale might give you short-term relief, but what about long-term prospects? The second option, if you become a day laborer, what would your life be like? Well, to try to imagine what that was like, I'd like to jump ahead into the New Testament and reflect on a parable that Jesus tells about day laborers. And you know this story very well. You find it in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 20, verses 1 to 16. And in it, Jesus describes a vineyard owner who goes into the town square where all the day laborers are gathering early in the morning, and he starts to hire day laborers. And as the story progresses, you remember how it goes, he repeats this action 5 times, finally hiring one more crew at 5 in the afternoon. We're not told why he does this, but perhaps it was harvest time and there's an urgency to get the crop in before it spoils, and perhaps he had underestimated in the morning how many workers it was going to take and how fast they could do the picking of the grapes. But for whatever reason, he keeps coming and hiring more and more. You remember how the parable ends, right? So at the end of the day, the vineyard owner calls his manager and says, and now I'm quoting from Matthew 20, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first." And when those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received a denarius. Now when the first came, they thought, oh, good. If those ones came at the end of the day and they got a denarius, I wonder what we're going to get. And you know what they got. Yeah. They too got a denarius. And when they received it, they start grumbling against the landowner and they say, "These last worked only 1 hour." And pay attention to this line. "You have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the day in the scorching heat." But the landowner replied to him, "Friend, I'm doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius?" And that "I'm doing you no wrong," the word in there is justice. I'm not doing you any injustice. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give this last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or is your eye evil because I am good? Now, I saw somebody's eyebrow go up on that one because you're used to hearing, or are you envious because I am generous? Actually, that's not what the Greek text says. It's, is your eye evil because I am good? And what it's talking about is evil eye envy. You know, if they hadn't seen what the last ones got, they would have been perfectly happy with their one denarius. But we fall prey so easily to, but look at what that one got. Well, I should get more, shouldn't I? What do you think of this parable? I never liked it. I tried very hard in my years to understand it, but it just seemed entirely unfair to me. I eventually recognized that what made me so uncomfortable was where I identified myself in the story. So I identified with the ones who worked since early morning, and it seemed really unjust to me that they wouldn't get more for the extra work they did. So as a cradle Catholic who spent my whole adult life working in the so-called vineyard of the Lord, I realized I'm expecting increased compensation for all my time and labor. 2 incidents helped me see it differently. One was when my grandfather died. My father's father was a good man, but he was not Catholic. And as youngsters, I remember praying novena after novena for Grandpa to become Catholic, because in those days, only Catholics went to heaven. So it was with great joy that we learned that when Grandpa died of a heart attack in the hospital, before he died, he received 5 of the 7 sacraments on his deathbed. So that mitigated our sorrow at losing Grandpa, but at his funeral, the priest who presided and preached chose, oddly enough, he chose that gospel of Matthew 20 that we've just been talking about the workers in the vineyard. And he likened what happened with my grandpa to the parable, and he likened it to people who are going on a trip by train. And he described how some people plan way ahead and they buy their tickets far in advance. They get to the station early and they board ahead of everybody else. Then there are others who dash into the station at the very last minute, buy their ticket, barely make it on board before the train pulls away, and where are they sitting? Right next to the person who bought their ticket way in advance and planned ahead and did everything right. And they both get to the same destination at the same time. Well, that helped me like the parable a little better, as long as we're talking about my grandpa. And the destination is heaven, and I want him to be there with the rest of us. I wasn't so sure about other people, but I shared this insight with a group in Denver some years ago when I was giving a workshop there on the parables, and after I told my story, we took a break, and a woman in the group came up to me and she said, "Well, that was very nice about your grandpa, but that's not how I see this parable." And so she told me that she was a single mother whose husband had left her with 3 small children, and she said, "I have no education and no marketable skills. I go to the unemployment office day after day, hoping against hope that somebody will hire me." She says, "That's how I see the day laborers in the parable." She said, "They're like me." And she continued, "Who are the people who get hired right away? Well, of course, they're the ones that look the strongest, the youngest, the most healthy, the hardest working. The people who get left behind and don't get hired until there's nobody else left are the ones who look sick, weak, old, have disabilities." And so when the vineyard owner, she continued, finally hires them, the only thing that will help them is if they get paid a denarius, the usual daily wage. She says, how would anything else be of any use to them? How would they feed their family if they got anything less? And she said, yeah, sure, the ones who worked hard since the beginning of the day, they were out in the hot sun and they worked longer. But, she said, they had the assurance all day long that at the end of the day, they were going to be able to feed their babies. So she says, as I see it, the vineyard owner is like God. And in God's realm, everyone deserves to eat. And it doesn't matter how much you work or how long. So I was quite impacted by this interpretation, and I instantly saw that this woman understood the parable from the perspective of the poorest, the insecure day laborers. And that's probably the interpretation that was closest to what Jesus' first hearers understood by that parable. I was touched this morning reading a story in the New York Times, maybe you saw it too, about the thousands and thousands of day laborers who are completely left in the lurch now in California. All the ones who were gardeners and housekeepers and tended children and did all the day labor for the richer people in California, with the fires, their livelihood is gone. It's a good illustration of the precariousness of life for a day laborer. So back to one other comment about this, what this parable gives us a glimpse of. It's not only a glimpse of the life of a day laborer, but also gives us a sense of what Jubilee was meant to accomplish. That just like the woman in Denver said to me, the idea is that there's equity in the community and that everyone has enough to eat. And so that line in the parable, you have made them equal to us. Yes, that's exactly right. God has made all of us equal, beneficiaries of all of God's goodness. And that is what God chooses to do with God's good graces and beneficence. So going back now to the question of what would you do if you fell into deep, deep debt? So you can sell your land, you can become a day laborer, and there's one other option, and that is that you can indenture yourself to somebody who's richer until your debts are met. Now, if you're getting an image in your head of this being chattel slavery, that's not the situation. Chattel slavery is a form of slavery in which individuals are treated as personal property, and they can be bought, sold, and owned, and abused. And this system, as we know, dehumanizes enslaved people, reduces them to commodities, and strips away all their rights, autonomy, and identity. That was the kind of slavery that enslaved Africans who were brought from Central and West Africa to this country, that's the kind of slavery they endured in the 17th to the 19th centuries. The kind of slavery in Israel was different, and the kind of slavery that the Jubilee is talking about is debt slavery. So it's when a person willingly chose to bind himself to a particular family for a particular time and in order to pay off their debts. Now, the Jubilee law in Leviticus 25 demands that in the Jubilee year, you just release everybody from all their debts. You just wipe the slate clean. Some people tried to get around it by stopped lending money a year or two before the Jubilee year so that they wouldn't be on the hook for letting everybody go scot-free with their debts. That's cheating. That's not in the spirit of the Jubilee year. So in the Jubilee, everybody gets released from your debts. But there's also another important piece in the Jubilee year legislation, and that is that it also ordered the humane treatment of anyone who is enslaved. So those who fell into debt slavery were to be treated with dignity and justice. They were not to be charged interest on their debts, nor were the owners allowed to make profit on the food sold to them. And the law insists that when Israelites did enslave themselves to other Israelites, their owners were to treat them not as slaves, but as hired servants until the Jubilee release. So we know how you fix things for if you've been if you indenture yourself. We know that how the Jubilee year fixes that. But what if, let's go back to option one again. What if you sold your land? Well, if you did that, then there was a way out. There was a solution. There was a restoration come the Jubilee year. The Jubilee proclamation says, "It shall be a jubilee for you when every one of you shall return to your own property, every one to their family estate." That's verse 10 in Leviticus 25. So the return of one's family property wasn't simply giving back the property to the original owner, but it was repurchased according to a just price. And underlying this stipulation was the recognition, and this is important, was that that Israelites had the attitude that the land did not belong to any of them. The land was not their property, neither individually nor of families, but it belongs to God alone. So Leviticus 25:23 says, "The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine, and you are but aliens who have become my tenants." Another thing to remember is that when Israel entered the promised land, the land was parceled out equitably to each of the tribes. We get that in the first 22 chapters of the book of Joshua. But economic hardship caused some people to sell their tribal lands, with the result then that some people became large landholders and others were displaced from the land. The Jubilee comes in and redistributes the land by returning the tribal heritage to all the original owners. The Jubilee is a reset, So finally, during the Jubilee year, the land itself was to have a year of rest. The land was to remain uncultivated. The Israelites were not to sow their fields or prune their vineyards. Now these stipulations are in Deuteronomy 25. They were not to reap any harvest that grew of itself, nor gather any grapes from the undressed vine, but such spontaneous fruit was to be for the poor people and the animals, both domestic and wild. So the purpose of all of these regulations for the Jubilee year was to ensure justice within the community. Redistribution of the land was aiming for equity. Nobody should be deprived of home or livelihood. And it would also prevent a permanent class of slaves from developing in Israel. The law insisted on the dignity of all Israelites. All Israelites were brother and sister to one another and were to be treated as family members. And so and also the law reminds Israel that if you are one to whom another person has bound themselves in debt slavery, don't you ever forget that you were slaves in Egypt, and I'm the one that set you free. And you need to act out of that stance. So let's talk for just a minute. So I've been talking about Old Testament times, and probably these laws developed right after the exile. And so fast forward now to New Testament times, and that's Jesus's Bible. the Old Testament. And when we turn to New Testament, though, we see that the Jubilee has already arrived and become a permanent way of being. So in Luke's Gospel, when Jesus is announcing his ministry for the first time, he gets up in his hometown synagogue. This is in Luke chapter 4, verses 18 and 19. And he announces, here's my mission. And he's quoting Isaiah 62, verses 1 and 2. And you remember what he says. He says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor," translate the Jubilee year, to proclaim the Jubilee year. And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him, and then he began to say, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." So what Luke's depiction of Jesus means for us is that just as Jesus frames his mission as bringing Jubilee to fruition, so the whole of Christian life then should be characterized by a spirit of Jubilee. So the notions that underlie the Jubilee practice in the Old Testament is what we should be living out of as Jesus' followers, and rejoicing always in the reality, not just the hope for, but the reality of justice among us, economic justice, justice for earth, freedom from anything that enslaves anyone or diminishes any human dignity in any way. So, if we're supposed to be living Jubilee all the time, what's the point of a Jubilee year then? Well, I would say it's just like we have Lent every year. We're supposed to be forgiving all the time. We're supposed to be deepening in our relationship with God and with Jesus all the time. But special times help us to put a laser focus on what's the intent of this living. And so a Jubilee year is an opportunity for us to shine the spotlight more intently on the particular actions and attitudes that we can cultivate more fully, that embody the biblical tradition of Jubilee. As Alicia already reminded us, that in declaring the Jubilee year, Pope Francis spoke of the pain and the suffering and the destruction of community that has happened all over the world since the global pandemic. And that's what caused him to choose the theme, Pilgrims of Hope. He wanted, as Alicia quoted for us, but I think it bears repeating, he wanted, quote, to restore a climate of hope and trust as a prelude to the renewal and rebirth that we so urgently desire. He continued, this will indeed be the case if we are capable of recovering a sense of universal community and refuse to turn a blind eye to the tragedy of rampant poverty that prevents millions of men, women, young people, and children from living in a manner worthy of our human dignity. And he continues, here I think in particular of the many refugees forced to abandon their native lands. May the voices of the poor be heard throughout this time. This time, when he was writing, it was the preparation for the Jubilee. In this time of preparation for the Jubilee, which is meant to restore access to the fruits of earth to everyone. And then he goes on, as the Bible teaches, the Sabbath of the land shall provide food for you yourself, and for your male and female slaves, and for your hired servant, and the sojourner who lives with you, for your cattle also, and for the beasts that are in your land, all its yield shall be for food. Have you ever noticed how much emphasis there is on food in the Bible? One of my colleagues, who's now retired, but Old Testament professor Leslie Hoppy, he pointed out to me how often there's emphasis on food in the Bible. And he said, look at the Psalms, for example. Count up how many times there's lines in the Psalms asking God to make sure don't forget to feed us. And think of Psalm 23, for example. You can probably recite that one from heart. The Lord is my shepherd, leads me to green pastures, so fruitful lands. And then verse 5, a little further on, you prepare a banquet for me. Or think about Isaiah's image of eschatological times when the ideal is this fabulous banquet of rich foods and flowing wine. Yeah, that's the most wonderful thing people could think of, is never having to worry about food. Or think even of the prayer we pray every day that Jesus taught his disciples, that's in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Give us this day our daily bread. So in biblical times, both Old and New Testament times, constant worry about the land producing enough food was the daily reality of the ancient Israelites, as well as Jesus' first followers. Most of us have the opposite problem. We have and we consume too much food. And yet, here in the U.S., 1 out of every 8 American adults is struggling to afford enough food. 1 in 5 children in this country are hungry. Nearly 30% of people in the globe, so about 2.4 billion people, don't have adequate access to food. And yet, the UN World Food Program reports there is enough food to feed everyone in the world. So I wonder if one of the things that this Jubilee year could prompt us to not only reflect on, but also act upon, is can we find a way both to feed hungry people through soup kitchens and other forms of charitable work, but even more, can we work with organizations that are looking to transform the systems that keep people from having enough food to eat? Might part of the way forward involve the way that we care for earth? In ancient Israel, the land was to rest in the Jubilee year. What is it earth is asking of us in this Jubilee year? There's an episode that appears in all 4 Gospels, twice in each of the Synoptic Gospels, that might take us a little further into how to get an answer to that thorny question that we're posing about just distribution of food, and point us toward what kind of action will ensure adequate access to food for all. You know the story well. It happens when a large crowd has been following Jesus and listening to him teaching. The day is wearing on, and people are getting hungry. Jesus' disciples come to him. And you remember their solution? Yeah. Send them away so they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy something for themselves to eat. But he says, you give them something to eat. And they said, are we to go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? And he said, oh, for goodness sake, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. So they find out, and they come back, and they say 5 and 2 fish, and then he ordered them to get all the people to sit down in groups. This is community organizing, I think, on the green grass. And so they sat down in groups of hundreds and 50s, and taking the 5 loaves, you know what Jesus does. So I won't repeat the whole story, but you know what he does. And at the end, those who had eaten the loaves numbered 5,000 men. That's Mark's version. Matthew ends the story, 5,000 men, not counting the women and the children. In a Jubilee mindset, we must always be counting the women and children, or asking, where are the women and children? They're often the ones most adversely affected when there are economic inequities and food insecurities. But I think this gospel episode can help us ponder how the solution was not to send people away individually, everybody fend for themselves. The solution is within community. Together, they had among them all the resources and more to feed everyone until everyone was full. So, can Jesus help us in this Jubilee year to find the way to do that today in our globe? Another concern Pope Francis named in his letter of preparation for the Jubilee was the many refugees forced to abandon their native lands. In the spirit of the Jubilee laws of ancient Israel, which aimed at restoring ancestral lands to those who had lost them, I wonder what can we do to advocate for justice and peaceful living conditions worldwide so that there isn't the high need for people to take refuge in lands far away from their ancestral homes. Failing that, how do we welcome them into a new land to call home, to become their new ancestral land? In the Jubilee year, ancient Israel freed all the enslaved persons. So we might at first say, well, I don't think there's anything in that for us to do. We got rid of slavery in this country back with the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation. But in reality, there are other forms of slavery equally horrific in our day all over the globe. The statistics are very hard to gather, but the UN estimates that there are more than 50 million people living in slavery now globally. And by slavery, meaning forced labor, forced marriages, forced sexual exploitation. And women and girls are the bulk of those enslaved persons, about more than 70%, and at least a quarter of them are children. In his message for the World Day of Peace 10 years ago, on the 1st of January 2015, Pope Francis urged us to do everything we can to end these modern-day forms of slavery that rob people of their humanity and dignity, and work so that all can flourish as God's beloved children. And he titled that address, "No Longer Slaves, but Brothers and Sisters." He was quoting St. Paul's letter to the Galatians, chapter 4, verse 7. But it also makes me think of what Jesus says to his disciples at the Last Supper in John 15, I no longer call you slaves, but friends. So how do we adopt a mindset where we work to ensure that all are friends, brothers, sisters to us, and all have equitable sharing of the goods? So, as I commented earlier, the kind of slavery that Israel had was debt slavery, and then for the Jubilee year, you release people from their debts and from bondage. So, what does it take to do that? And what does it take for us to be able to live out of that spirit of not demanding repayment to the last penny for anything that we have loaned out, whether that's personally or whether that's on a bigger scale? What does it take to be able to do that? There's a parable, another one in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 18, which talks about a king who decides to call in all the debts of his slaves. And I find it a rather disturbing parable and a rather complicated one. Let's walk through it and see what it can tell us about what kind of stance, what kind of attitude is asked of us for releasing people from debt. And so it starts out, it's got 3 scenes. Scene 1, the king begins his reckoning, and there's one slave who owes him 10,000 talents. So this is a huge amount. He's brought in, he can't pay. The Lord ordered him to be sold together with his wife and children and all his possessions and to make payment right away to pay off the debt that he owes the king. The slave, as you remember the story, falls on his knees and begs, "Have patience with me and I will pay you everything." Well, the guy's living in La La Land. There's no way he can pay all of that, no matter what. You can sell all of us, and that's still not going to pay off this debt. And you throw him in prison, that's not going to do anything, because how does he earn money in prison to pay off the debt? So this is, but he's desperate. And the king, the English translation for this just doesn't do it justice. The translation that I was looking at said, "out of pity for him." That's not what it says. In Greek, it's splanknistes. Splankna are your guts, your innards. And it's gut-wrenching compassion. A little less visual might be heartfelt mercy. But the king is filled with gut-wrenching compassion, mercy for him, and says to the slave, "Release him. Let the debt go." Now, if the story ended there, what would you think of it? Yeah. This is unbelievable. This is just dreams come true if you're the debtor, you know. So it doesn't end there, though. Scene 2. But that same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii. Not so much. That's 100 days' wage. And seizing him by the throat, he says, "Pay what you owe." The fellow slave fell down, pleaded with him, "Have patience with me, I will pay you." So far, it's the same story as scene 1, right? But on a smaller scale. So, how are we expecting this scene to end? But there's a twist. But he refused, and he went and threw him into prison until he would pay the debt. Oh, that's a brilliant solution. How's he going to make money in prison? And that's where that scene ends. Now what do you think? What do you think about the guy who had been forgiven the huge debt? What do you think about him now? There's a third scene. When his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their lord all that had taken place. Then his lord summoned him and said to him, "You wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy, eleisai, on your fellow slave?" So Kyrie eleison, it's that word. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave, as I had mercy, eleisa, as I had mercy on you? And in anger, the Lord handed him over to be tortured until he would pay his entire debt. So what do you think now? Of the king? Of the slave? Are you happy with the ending? Are you cheering with the fellow slaves who were upset with the forgiven servant and say, "Yeah, you deserve this"? One of the messages that the parable conveys is, if God is like the king in scene 1, then we have a metaphor for the way God deals with us. All is given. All is grace. All is gift. There's no way to earn it. There's no way to buy it. God just wants to give it all to us for free. The king is full of mercy, boundless loving kindness. What kind of response do you make to that? To such an immense gift of merciful love? You can't pay it back. God doesn't need it anyway. And on top of that, God never works in a tit-for-tat economy. And so what are we to do? What was that forgiven slave supposed to do in scene 2? Supposed to have done like what the king did. He should have forgiven the debt. He should have paid it forward. He should have emulated the way that the king behaved to him. But it's not very easy to live in a realm of boundless mercy. It's uncomfortable for us because we're not in control. I'd rather earn my way, dear God. Thank you very much. I'll keep on doing all my good deeds and hope you're counting them, just like St. Nick. It's hard to live in that kind of a space. And it demands a huge openness on our part and a surrender that is very, very difficult. So, if we found ourselves cheering with the slaves in scene 3 who wanted the forgiven slave to be treated harshly after he had been so unsympathetic to his fellow slave, after he had been treated with mercy and then he doesn't return it, if you find yourself cheering, yes, he deserves to be punished after the way he behaved. We've just slipped out of the I live in a world of boundless mercy that I receive and that you receive and that we all receive. If I've just flipped over into vindictiveness and vengeance, then I've missed the gift. And the last line of the parable, I am tempted to leave it off because I think it might have been an add-on from the evangelist, and it might be pointing us in the wrong direction of what I think the message of the parable is. But anyway, let me try to make sense out of it within the context of the way I've been describing this parable. So it ends with, "So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart." Whoa, so does that mean that God becomes punitive and vindictive after all if we don't follow what God asked us to do? Or maybe the way to make sense of it is this, that we determine how the story ends. And that's typical of parables. Almost all the parables in the Gospels, there's no, so the moral of the story is. They're left for us to say, what? And Jesus is smiling and saying, yep, that's right. What is up to you to figure out what? And so I think it means that it's up to us how it ends. So God longs for us to let ourselves be mercied and let our hearts be transformed by that mercy and live in that mercy. And the best evidence of a transformed heart is how we treat our brother or sister. We can choose to be like God, extend mercy to others, because we know ourselves to have been utterly mercied by God. But if we prefer tit-for-tat justice, then that's what we'll get. God longs for us to go the way of mercy and pass it forward. But God can't force us to accept that. And if we don't, if we want to stay in control and do tit for tat, consequences are pretty dire. So, Pope Francis is asking us in this Jubilee year to let ourselves be mercied. And then that guides us as how to be pilgrims of hope. And he reminds us that the source of our hope is God's mercy, God's grace. If the parables we've been looking at with the vineyard owner and the workers and the king who forgives, if these make us uncomfortable, I think it's because they show us a vastly different understanding of justice, Jubilee justice, from other notions of justice and equity. Biblical justice is not about everyone getting what they deserve. It's about how God puts everything in right relation through a process that starts by showering boundless mercy and love on everyone. When people miss the mark, the way back to right relation is not through vindictive punishment. It's through mercy. It's always the way God does it. And so one of the things that Pope Francis explained in his proclamation of the Year of Mercy in 2015, and I think I'd give him an A+ for this one. He says, justice and mercy are not two contradictory realities, but two dimensions of a single reality that unfolds progressively until it culminates in the fullness of love. Mercy is God's way of reaching out to the sinner, offering that one a new chance. So the way to get everybody back in an equitable community of brothers and sisters living in right relationship is not through punitive means, but through extending mercy, forgiveness, just as we have been mercied limitlessly. So Jubilee living invites us to radically rethink some of our notions about justice, about what we deserve. What does that "you have made them equal to us" urge us to move toward? If we've been given so much, then another factor in our ability to pay things forward is that we live out of a spirituality of abundance. We have been given everything and all freely. And so why not share it freely? Why not? So as Pilgrims of Hope, I've given only a few examples of how we might appropriate what the original Jubilee legislation urged the Israelites to do. Our context is very different, but the spirit in which it was composed and what it asked of the ancient Israelites, the spirit of that and the kind of spirituality for us to embrace, I think is still the same. The actions are going to be different. Our context is different. But maybe some of their actions and some of Jesus's parables help point the way of what are the concrete things that we can do as pilgrims of hope. And ultimately, the whole point of Jubilee, jubilation, is that we live lives in joyful freedom all the time. That's all. Amen. May I make one PS, and that is that they don't let me out of CTU without bringing along promo material. I left some of these flyers on the table out there. Please pick them up if you're interested. If you would like to participate in our renewal program during Lent, every morning, Monday through Thursday in Lent, we have another one of our faculty who will give an hour-long talk on all kinds of different topics about theology, scripture, liturgy, spirituality, and it promises to be a good experience. You don't have to sign up for the whole program. You can pick and choose. You can sign up for just an individual session or two. So I'd like to invite you to do that. And experiment around on our website. We have a lot of free stuff, a lot of free lectures. We almost always live stream whatever we offer, and you're very, very welcome. Okay, now I'll stop, and I think Mike is going to come around with a microphone if anybody has a comment or a question.
Yes, thank you, Sister Barbara. Thank you for this evening. If anybody would like to ask a question, just throw your hand up, and I will bring you the microphone so we can all hear your brilliant question. Students, I'm sure you can find extra credit somewhere. The other Sister Barbara.
Barb, this is kind of a nitpicking question, I think, but when you were talking about the first chapters of Joshua, I've always wondered, when they took over that land, whose land had it been? I mean, you know.
Thank you for asking that question. Yeah, how did the Canaanites feel when the Israelites got their promised land? Yeah, that's an important question to ask, and so I would be a little less celebratory about them taking the land of the Canaanites and making it their own and claiming that it was God's gift to them. Yeah. No, you're at it.
It's happening right now.
It's, yeah, Thank you, yeah. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, so if there were any Canaanites still alive, we might, Jubilee might say, give it back to the Canaanites. Yeah.
Thank you, sister. I don't know how to phrase this, but the parable made me realize this for the first time that, and it's one of the problems with sort of an abundance of generosity, sort of an unthinking abundance of generosity that might be an imprudent abundance of generosity, and the king forgives the one servant. So the servant's attitude is, hey, great, I'm footloose and fancy free. I don't have any debts anymore, and kind of free to do what I please now that I've been released by the king. And that's always a danger with generosity. It's I bequeath, these gifts upon the person, and then the person starts doing things with the gifts that, hey, I didn't want you to do that with it.
Yeah. That's the problem with gifts. You can't control what the recipient does with a free gift. And a colleague of mine some time ago shared this insight with me, and it has stayed with me. It's something in it I think really resonates with me, and that is that this friend of mine has a habit of whenever a street person is asking for money, he always gives them money. And there are people who criticize him for that and say, but they're just going to go out and buy alcohol with that. And he says, it's not my work to decide what they do with the money. My job is to respond to the need that they presented to me, and my job is to respond with generosity because I can. He says it's not my job to figure out to worry about whether they're going to use it in the way that I would like to see them use it. That's not the whole answer, but it's something to think about, I think. Yeah. And God can't control what we do. With all the free gifts that God gives us, God cannot control how we're going to receive it.
Thank you.
We can harden our hearts and get greedy and jealous and individualistic, and God is going to keep working on us and keep trying to get us to turn, but God can't force us to do it. Yeah.
Barb, do we have any examples where we might think that Israel at the time of Jesus practiced some of these Jubilee things, like giving land back when the Romans are in charge of so much? Or
Yeah, thank you for that question. What I'd say is in Old Testament times there is some debate among scholars about whether or not the Jubilee laws were ever actually enacted in the way they're prescribed. There are a couple of texts that indicate that indeed they were. In Jesus's time, his early followers understood that it was being enacted in his very person and in the way that he was teaching them to interact with one another. So, a different version of Jubilee distribution we find in Acts of the Apostles, the end of the 2nd chapter and the end of the 4th chapter. Luke describes how the early Christians were one in mind and heart. They devoted themselves to prayer together every day, and they pooled all of their resources, and each took according to their need. Not everybody got the same, but each took according to their need, and so that there were none who were poor. So the ideal all the way through the scriptures is that there be no poor among you. That's a line from Deuteronomy, that there be no poor among you. That is a scandal in God's eyes, that there are people who are hungry and without. And so the early Christians had ways of enacting that kind of economic redistribution, and some of it you see reflected in the call stories. So it says some of the disciples left everything and went and followed Jesus. Well, then you better have a Lydia, a Martha, who are going to support them, Mary Magdalene, who's bankrolling the mission. So another way to ensure that the traveling apostles are not going wanting is hospitality is so key in the early Christian communities. And so you have to have somebody on the end that's providing the hospitality, or that model of pooling all your resources. Some have the idea that the only real way to be a really top drawer disciple is leave everything and go follow Jesus. Not if you're reading Luke and Acts. In Luke and Acts, there's a variety of ways. What you do with your possessions is extremely important in terms of it has serious implications, how you live out your discipleship. And there's lots of warnings in Luke's gospel about the obstacle that having too many possessions can be to being able to have that freedom of heart and be able to respond to Jesus. But there's no one recipe. There's no one way in which you're supposed to do it. There's lots of different ways. Yeah. So Zacchaeus, for example, he gives half of his possessions away, and Jesus doesn't say, if you would give the other half away, like Peter and James and John, then you could really be in the top 12 here. He doesn't tell him that. He says this day, he calls him a child of Abraham, meaning you are an integral member of this community, and what you're doing is right. He affirms him. And Jesus says, this day salvation is here in this house. Yeah. Such good questions. Any other questions or comments?
I have one. I'm thinking about the luminous mysteries, and so you've got. It seems as though the beginning of Jesus' ministry is the baptism by John, and then the wedding at Cana, and then preaching the kingdom, and somewhere in there fits the story that you mentioned. Is it Luke 6, where he goes into the synagogue and reads the text of Isaiah?
4.
Luke 4. I'm thinking it's almost as if that's where he really is beginning his ministry, is in announcing the Jubilee, just kind of following out your comments.
Yeah.
And then follow out the last two mysteries.
In Luke's gospel, that is so.
At least in Luke.
Yes, in Luke's gospel, that's the way his mission starts. Is he identifies himself as Jubilee is fulfilled right here and now, and then he spends his whole ministry doing that, releasing people from debt, whether from sin or from illness or from what in those days they would have called demon possession. Anything keeping people bound, unequitable, he's on it. Okay.
Well, then I just follow the last two mysteries, where you go to the Transfiguration and then to the institution of the Eucharist. And I'm thinking about your comments about food. Mm-hmm. And the Eucharist obviously has a lot to do with food.
Sure does.
So Christ is feeding us, but is that somehow a call that we're supposed to feed each other?
I think that's an excellent connection, that feeding story in the gospel where everybody gets fed. It's described exactly. Jesus' actions in that story are exactly mirror the actions at the Last Supper for the institution of Eucharist. And so yes, and in Luke's gospel, Jesus says, do this in memory of me, or remember me when you do this. And remember in the Bible never means just intellectual recall. It means make it present now. So in the very words of institution in Luke's gospel, it says, what you saw him doing in all these Jubilee practices, make it happen now. in your gathered assemblies and as you go forth from that assembly. Make that happen in real life. Yeah, thank you for that connection.
All right, I think we've got time for one more question. Father Bob. Oh, Father Bob or Father Doug?
Okay, there's a competition between my Dominican brothers here about who gets the last question.
Okay.
We can talk after.
Yeah. Again, in complex society and complex world that we have as well, one of the things about looking at the poor is that it behooves us not to think of ourselves as patronizingly taking care of and leaving it there. There's been some statements there was a statement of like, well, if we could only give $84 billion, we would solve all the poverty in the world. The answer would be short term, maybe. But oftentimes, it's, again, looking at personhoods. The poor are very smart people, but they lack access a lot of times. That's why education is a really key thing. But other things like right to title of property or businesses and different things like that. It's like going to, when they had the earthquake in Haiti, the world responded, but we brought in all kinds of things in Haiti. We also bankrupted people who had their own aluminum companies and things like that because we didn't use any of theirs. We're taking care of them. And so I think there's the charity elements, and there's the kind of, if you want to call it justice qualities or social justice, economic social justice. So that's the complexity of it all, but it makes us think about how we also participate in walking with people that may not have the resources. That's why sometimes I've seen students here who would not necessarily have the resources to come here, and somehow packages have been put together that they can continue to be a student here at Aquinas and graduate. That is a huge help for them. And what is it? That person's doing it on their own, but they needed the access. So I think that's another element of thinking it through.
It's very complex how to solve global poverty, and the systems absolutely need to be understood so that you don't do more damage through goodwill, but more damage. One of the other keys, and you hinted at this, that is really critical is not to, I try to not say the poor. And first of all, it lumps faceless people into a class of people to be pitied or to be, and you rightly said that's not the attitude to take toward people who have been made poor. I try to put person or people first, and then people who have been made poor. The same thing with people with disabilities. Not the blind man that Jesus healed, but the person who suffered from blindness that Jesus healed. To put the person and their dignity first, who happen to be economically disadvantaged or who happen to have a physical disability. And then the other key thing is, do you know a person with a face and a name that is economically disadvantaged? Or is it a faceless lump of people that you, out of the kindness of your heart, want to help and donate money, but Pope Francis keeps pointing us toward the importance of encounter, of personal encounter. And that's what happened in the Good Samaritan parable. The Jew that got left for dead on the side of the road would have hated all of those Samaritans. They were all a lump of faceless enemies. But when one saves his life, that personal encounter changes how he thinks about that whole class of people now. And so I think too that it's a critical element when we're trying to work at creating community and transforming inequitable systems. It's about real people with names and faces, and if we can be working together, and oftentimes they have the solutions. They can tell you what they need, you know. That's what Jesus did in the feeding of the 5,000. You've got the solution. It's in your midst. Don't go running off and don't go sending people off individually. You've got the solution and you've got everything you need right here. We've got all the resources. But what might be needed is a change of heart in how we understand how the resources are produced and distributed and where the roadblocks are for getting equitable distribution in our day and age. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much. It's been a delight to be with you.
Don't go, don't go, don't go. I was going to say that you mentioned the Jubilee year being the year of the Lord's favor. Well, we've all been favored by the Lord having you come start our Jubilee year. So please, one more round of applause. Thank you so much. I just want to mention, every month, as I said in the beginning, we will have another speaker throughout the entire year. So on Thursday, January 30th, I guess we have 2 this month, don't we? Dr. John Panero, he's a former faculty member here at Aquinas College and now at the Acton Institute, will be speaking at Alberta's Hall of Science in the lecture hall there on Church and State, Hope in an Age of Ideology. So I hope you all will come back again then, but I'm not quite sure. It will be hard to continue the year with other speakers, although keep the context and the ideas. What a beautiful way to start the year and to think about the Jubilee year. Thank you again, Sister Barbara.